Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Ward Churchill, writer and activist in Atlanta, and co-author of two recently released books. Co-author of Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret War Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, and co-author of the COINTELPRO papers, documents from the FBI's Secret War Against Dissent in the United States of America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Ward Churchill.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, why did you produce these books?
Well, they've been reprinted. They're older. The Agents of Repression came out in 1988 initially, and COINTELPRO papers came out 2 years later, and they remained in print into the 2000s. They've been out of print for a while. Black Classic Press decided that it was important that they be returned to circulation, so they can be had now, again, in reprint form with a new introduction from Black Classic Direct, or I suppose Amazon or your local bookstore, as the case may be. But at the point where I decided to do it, my background is, in the immediate sense, with regard to the books, the American Indian Movement. And I was heavily involved in formulating the defense, the appellate defense work with Leonard, Peltier, American Indian Movement. Soldier, warrior, leader, manager, whatever, various terms have been used, who is still doing 2 consecutive life sentences for deaths in a firefight on 2 FBI agents on Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota in 1975. And you had a response from the government. This was not the first book to deal with this. Most importantly, you had Peter Matheson come out with In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, which is a 600-page study of this by a very well-respected writer. And he was immediately sued by the Attorney General of South Dakota and one of the FBI agents in the book, which tied that volume up for more than 10 years. So it was out of print, and we needed, for organizing purposes, something that went to this. So Agents of Repression, being first, focuses heavily on the FBI's operations in the mid-1970s against, aim on, and around Pine Ridge. Highlights Peltier considerably, but frames those operations more broadly in the context of FBI operations against strong dissenting organizations, Black Liberation Movement organizations in particular, and more particularly the Black Panther Party. So we went beyond what Matheson had done, somewhat more succinctly. It was a different approach taken to the same subject matter. And you could say it was because there was nothing else available that really dealt with that. Then COINTELPRO papers comes out because in the process of putting agents together, we come up with all kinds of additional repressive activities that the FBI had engaged in under this cryptonym that they had deployed in the mid-1950s, COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. That was a misnomer. It was secret because it was illegal, that they were not involved in counterintelligence. They were not involved in combating the penetration of foreign national intelligence organizations in the U.S., with a possible exception at the incept. They may have been concerned with Soviet agents operating under the auspices of the Communist Party USA. and that was the original COINTELPRO in 1956. But Socialist Workers' Party, that's a Trotskyist organization, so there was no possibility of Soviet agents working within its rubric, its construction. Puerto Rican independence movement, which was taken as a target of this secret program of repression. No, there's no suggestion that they were concerned about Soviet, possibly Cuban, but not Soviet. We give them the benefit of the doubt on the Cuban, although in a process of penetrating and investigating and disrupting, otherwise dealing with the independence movement, they would have quickly learned that it was not functioning on the basis of instructions from a foreign power. Then you had Black Liberation Movement, or more properly, I suppose, the Civil Rights Movement first, because Southern Christian Leadership Council was among the first targets, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also Congress of Racial Equality. All right. All of these were targeted in a range of ways for not necessarily anything to do with law enforcement. In fact, quite distinct from law enforcement, the objective stated in their internal documents and in the words of the people in charge of what was called Section 5 of the FBI, the domestic intelligence apparatus. The objective was to neutralize the target. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can discredit them, you can cause them to be distrusted by their peers, which clearly inhibits their effectiveness in organizing. You can arrest them. You can target an organization and arrest as many members as possible, not with any anticipation necessarily of obtaining convictions, but forcing them into posting bail, hiring attorneys, mounting a defense. You can bankrupt dissident organizations that way. You can tie up their membership, and particularly their leadership, in mounting legal defense. It leaves no time for political work. You can foment hostilities between groups, within groups, through the rumor mongering, the discrediting activities I was talking about, which is usually the result of efforts by infiltrators, provocateurs. That's different from informants. They develop informants to gather intelligence, but infiltrators and provocateurs go in to disrupt and to engage in activities which, in combination with FBI propaganda efforts through friendly cooperating journalists and so forth, serve to tarnish the image of key individuals and organizations and the organizations themselves through dissemination of false information. You can do it by obtaining false convictions, extra-legal use of the judicial system, targeting, again, what they call key activists or key agitators. Or you can foment hostilities that will result in deaths between groups, as was done with the Los Angeles Black Panther Party juxtaposition to, the US organization, which was called United Slaves, somewhat disparagingly in the day. That can result in fatalities, injuries, fragmentation of organizations. All those pertained in Los Angeles, but not only in Los Angeles. It happened in New Jersey. It happened other places as well. And finally, outright assassinations. Now, that can be done through surrogates, or it can be done more directly. FBI, I'm not aware of any assassination carried out directly by FBI personnel. In the cases that I would say fit this assassination scenario more officially. They deployed police entities, a criminal conspiracy section in Los Angeles, for example. That element of the police utilized its resources to effect assassinations of Bunchy Carter, John Huggins, among others. And then the police themselves attempted to assassinate Geronimo Pratt when you end up with the 41st and Central firefight, the overnight, basically siege that the first SWAT team in LA laid to the Panther headquarters. Very famous incident. Pratt was not there, he was in his apartment, but they had intelligence information from Infiltrator that provided them with very specific information as to where he would be, and they didn't try to arrest him initially. They fired through the exterior wall into his bed. The one piece of information he didn't have is that Geronimo Pratt was a former paratrooper, and he had back injury that made it difficult for him to sleep in a bed. He slept on the floor beside the bed. So, 4 days, I think it was, after the assassination of Fred Hampton, Mark Clark in Chicago by a special unit of police in LA attempted to replicate that in Los Angeles with Geronimo Pratt. And Pratt was a successor to Bunchy Carter, who had been assassinated by members of the rival group, us, a year earlier. Okay. Obtaining convictions that result in extremely long sentences, life sentences, or so forth, and or assassination, clearly neutralize the target. You're dead or you're locked in a cage for, a lot of these cases now, 45, 50 years. You're permanently neutralized. You're not going to engage in politically objectionable activity at that point. But if you discredited, same result in a way. Mm-hmm. You could, I suppose, turn around. And
let me summarize for Churchill for our audience. So you've been talking about the formation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation circa 1956 of COINTELPRO, which is this concerted effort by the U.S. government to subvert minimally different organizations, not least organizations involved in the Black liberation movement, especially the Black Panther Party.
Right.
You also mentioned that there was a criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, which operated similarly in the city of Los Angeles. You suggested that, for example, they were involved in similar disruptive activities. To your knowledge, does the criminal conspiracy section of the LAPD continue to exist? And also, what else do you have to share with our audience about the CCS?
Well, CCS was a sophisticated version of what historically has been referred to as a Red Squad. And they had considerable latitude tactically that they were allowed to exercise that went beyond normal policing. And they worked interactively with the COINTELPRO section of the Los Angeles field office of the FBI. So these are conjoint activities often. CCS, I'm not entirely sure it continues to exist or in that form under that heading. But changing a heading is not that difficult to do. And it's like in New York City, the Bureau of Strategic Services or Bureau of Special Services. I've seen it referred to even by the police under both those titles, boss, in other words. That was a comparable entity there. And it was disbanded by judicial order after a lawsuit in the early 70s. Right? But it continued to operate. It just operated under different headings and a different chain of command or command structure, using, in some cases, even the same personnel. You have that situation in Chicago. You probably have it in every major city. They don't call the Red Squad anymore. For one thing, they're not necessarily focused on people who are believed to be communist. They would focus anarchists or eco-terrorists, as they call them. People who are engaged in liberatory efforts to challenge the government, or anti-colonial, since we live in a settler state, an internal colonial structure, okay? Various colonies, American Indian reservations, American Indian peoples being probably the clearest example because of the treaty relations and so forth. But you have the original colonizing entity, the settlers who came in and constructed their own country to the exclusion of others from the get-go. Now, they've admitted others nominally over the years, but always at a disadvantage in comparison to their own position and privilege. So you have this ongoing colonial structure, okay? And then you have the colonized populations. And you have a fair number of people and organizations who have understood this to varying extents. The American Indian Movement understood it, at least from one time. Black Panther Party understood it. Revolutionary Action Movement understood it. The Republic of New Africa understood it. Kahn understood it. You know, we keep ticking them off. Certainly the Puerto Ricanos and the independence movement understood Puerto Rico to be a colony. So you've got this sort of combat that's going on. And it's become very fashionable to say, you know, well, on the one side, you've got the federal authorities, and on the other side, you've got these radicals or revolutionaries, and both sides are violent, and there's an equivalence there. No, there's not. Colonial violence is illegal under international law. Decolonizing violence is a right under international law. Now, we can parse all that, but there's a fundamental distinction to be drawn between those who use arms to defend themselves as their communities against the armed force of the colonizer on the one hand, and those who wield the weapons in behalf of colonial dominance on the other. Totally different. So we need to understand that in the history of how this has gone down.
Well, Ward Churchill, yeah. I'm afraid that we're at the end of our time here, but I'd like to thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles. Ward Churchill, writer and activist in Atlanta, co-author of the books Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret War Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, and co-author of the COINTELPRO papers, documents from the FBI's Secret War Against Dissent in the United States. Thank you once again for joining us on KPFK Freedom Now, Los Angeles.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Kehinde Andrews, Ward Churchill. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon Sankara, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, our board ops, Brother Wendell, Brother Yao, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our Sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing